Good evening and welcome to the New York Symposium with Diane Sayre. I'm Diane Sayre, an independent LaRouche candidate for US Senate in 2024, and this is September 15th. And as advertised, we're going to be talking about the assault on the innocence of our children, and I would say also on the development of our children. And I have some special guests who will be joining me. And let me say, as always, participation in the Sayre for Senate Symposium does not imply endorsement of a political campaign, but that people are joining the discussion in order to raise certain urgent topics of discussion. Now, before we get fully into our subject matter, let me just say that the world is really at an incredible crossroads where last week you had, or a couple weeks ago now, I guess, August 22nd through 24th, you had the BRICS summit in South Africa, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, large nations. India and China between them have about 3 billion of the world's 8 billion people. South Africa and Brazil are nothing to sneeze at in terms of size and scientific capability, and Russia with very advanced scientific capability, very large landmass, very rich in raw materials. Now, President Biden, in the true tradition of the British Empire, has made it his life's mission to destroy Russia with sanctions and with a proxy war in Ukraine. But what's actually happening is he's destroying the United States, and Russia is doing very well. It is not Russia which is isolated, it is the United States which is isolated, and we're becoming more and more isolated as most of the world rejects the policy of war, of terrorism, of trying to impose your will on other nations, and also our culture. Leaders in Africa who are bullied or attempted to be bullied because it's not working anymore by American officials from the State Department go and wag their finger. You shouldn't work with China. You shouldn't work with Russia. And the African leaders say, you know, when the Chinese come here, they build a railroad. When the Russians come here, they build a power plant. When your people come here, they give us a lecture about LGBTQ, etc., and a lecture on who we can work with, and you don't build anything. We're not interested. That's not what we want. Now, if the United States were in its proper anti-colonial identity, we would be joyously welcoming the dozens of nations who are throwing off the shackles of colonialism and the global financial institutions who have sought to enslave them. It was the policy of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to tell nations, yes, we'll give you a loan, but you're not allowed to use it for water sewage treatment. You can only use it for non-motorized vehicles. So you have to stay in the Stone Age. And by the way, we're going to devalue your currency. So when you repay us the loan, you're going to have to pay 20 times what you borrowed. And if you can't pay, we're going to steal your port. We're going to steal your railroad. Obviously, nations don't want to live under that. So there's a mistaken perception in the United States that somehow BRICS and now BRICS Plus, because 40 nations attended the BRICS conference, and out of that, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Argentina have been invited to join with the BRICS as of January of next year. And they are talking about creating a new currency. They want a currency that's pegged to gold or something in the real physical world that's not going to fluctuate up and down and allow them to be looted. I've run across a number of people who say, well, this is a threat to the US dollar. Hey, you know what? The dollar hasn't existed since 1971 when Nixon decoupled it from gold. The dollar is fictitious. I'm not saying we should let it go, but the way to save the dollar is not to try and crush other nations and keep them impoverished unless you want to have millions and millions of people trying to come to the United States because we've destroyed their country. The way to save the dollar is the US has to become a productive nation again. We have to build things, we have to produce, we have to go back to placing a value on the talents of every citizen. And that brings me to our discussion this evening, because what we will be hearing about shortly is some of the horrors and the ugliness about what is being done to our children. But some months ago, I had occasion to look at the curriculum that Alexander Hamilton was proposing for West Point, which was originally created as an engineering school. And I imagine people who entered it at that time were 17 or 18 years old. And the kind of things they were expected to learn were, of course, Latin, Greek, how to calculate the orbits of the planets, how to calculate the speed of light, how to all kinds of geometric constructions, physics, biology, multiple languages, French, German, Italian. That was the standard curriculum. That was what was expected of someone to be a citizen. When a child is 3, 4, 5 years old, that is the ideal time to put a violin in their hands, to give them a piano, to allow them to become a genius. Do you think Beethoven would have been the genius that he was? Was he not completely surrounded by classical music at the age of 3 and 4? Or Mozart composing symphonies by the time he was 6, 7, 8 years old? So it's not merely that we are destroying the young people by bombarding them with pornography and violence and things that degrade them and make them anxiety ridden, but we are robbing them of the opportunity to develop their God-given potential. And we are robbing our nation of the potential to have millions of geniuses running around who are rocket scientists, nuclear engineers, brilliant classical musicians, brilliant artists, brilliant writers who are making breakthroughs, or good people, dedicated people, people who become phenomenal nurses and doctors, teachers, educators, people who become great poets who learn 7 or 8 languages. We don't seem to have a mission because our nation does not have a mission right now except to crush other people. And that was never the intent of the United States. And the last thing I'll just say is during this BRIC summit, India successfully landed a rover near the South Pole of the moon, and they did it for something like $87 million. This is nothing. This is not even 1% of what we've sent to the very corrupt government in Ukraine. And they said apparently they have something like 100 schools who are training children, who are schools that are dedicated to preparing young people to be part of the space program. Can you imagine that? So why do they have these brilliant scientists, and are capable of this? Because they're casting a wide net. They want a large number of young people to love science and to love the idea of space exploration. And lo and behold, they're getting phenomenal results. Landing on the moon is very difficult. The Russians tried to get back there and they had a crash, and India itself crashed in 2019. So this was an amazing breakthrough. And when they make such a breakthrough, it's televised. So all the children in India get to see this rover landing on the moon and partake of the inspiration and excitement that that gives them. I don't believe we showed the Indian rover landing on the moon all over the United States, not that I'm aware of. So I think we have to have in mind not only to stop the evil, but what is the good and what is the potential that we want to develop. So with that, I would like to introduce you to Elena Diaz. You can see on her shirt when she's brought to the screen here, Moms for Liberty, which she's organizing with and leading in New York, in the Queens area. And I think I'll let her go ahead and introduce herself and her thoughts on this, and then we will open up for discussion. And if you have questions, you can put them in the YouTube chat or Facebook chat or otherwise. So Elena, welcome. I'm so glad you could be here this evening.
So much. Thank you for having me. So my name is Elena, actually Elena Diaz. I am the chapter chair of Queens County. Queens County is the first Moms for Liberty in the 5 boroughs. Moms for Liberty is a nonprofit, nonpartisan 501c4 organization that is nationwide. There are now 300 chapters, and I believe we're in, I think the last I heard, 47 states. In New York City, there is a chapter in Nassau, there's a chapter in Suffolk, and there are several chapters upstate. So we do have a number of chapters in New York, but they're not in the 5 boroughs. I am a retired guidance counselor. I retired 2 years early because of exactly what Diane is talking about, what is going on in the school system that I truly no longer could be a part of. And you're not allowed to disagree. What I saw was, that was literally harmful to the kids, because I was seeing children being told, you're an oppressor, you're a victim. We were starting to teach about the gender pronouns, and I was in elementary school. I was in the school for 23 years. The school was very well run. We had very low discipline, very few discipline problems. In fact, sometimes one time we were spoken to because they suspected we were not making reports, but we truly didn't have discipline problems. But somehow, suddenly after the pandemic, I was basically told everything that I'm doing is wrong. It's not enough to tell kids everyone's created equal. You have to be fighting for something. It was almost as if when we came back from the pandemic, I came to a whole nother galaxy. It wasn't the same kind of place anymore. The language was different. The attitudes was different. The administration that I loved was very different. And what I started to see was we weren't teaching children the things to be excellent. We weren't teaching them the violin or anything like that. We were starting to teach kids how to be activists. Now, for elementary school children, to teach a child to be an activist, first of all, they really don't understand life well enough to know what they're fighting about. Some of them, even the brighter ones, they will understand to some degree, but I don't feel kids have enough knowledge to really, make moral decisions yet. They're children, they're not supposed to. And I was against that. I said, what? I said, we are adults. We cannot even handle politics, and we're adults. Why are we going to put this kind of stuff on children? It just became, the school system became increasingly political for the adults in the school and for the children as well. And through the years, what I did notice is, we no longer held kids to any kind of standards. Tests became on time, tests became optional. If you were grading standardized tests, you were kind of instructed to give credit for anything, basically. We weren't holding kids to standards. We talked a nice talk, about expecting the best and having high expectations, but I didn't see where we were doing that. And I also didn't see where we were doing anything for those kids who really could succeed, and who were really doing well. There was very little done for the children, for the very bright children who had really a lot of potential. They kind of became lost in the system. Most of the attention really truly went on the lower performing kids, which was okay as long as there was some kind of a balance. We just kept lowering the bar on everything. I remember even when my own daughter was in school, she's 20 now, and I was told, don't correct her spelling. And this was at or around second grade. And I'm like, what do you mean don't correct her spelling? We were told to be culturally sensitive and not to correct people's English. And I always felt like, what do you mean? Why should some kids speak proper English and others kids not? How are you saying they're not capable? So many things became so glaring. And for 23 years, each year I found myself getting more disenchanted with what I was doing. But at the point at which I have to teach children they're victims, which totally went against everything I believed in. As a guidance counselor, I always taught kids to be resilient. I always taught them coping skills, and I never lied to them. I never told them everything was wonderful if it wasn't. I was always honest with children, and they appreciate that. Children want you to be honest with them. They know when you're lying. They know when you're telling them they're great and they're not. And they get a strong message when you do that you're not capable of being any better. So it just, I could no longer go to work every day. I'll be honest with you. I'm like, this is just all wrong. This is not the right thing. I see the direction we're going, and I can no longer do this. I don't believe in what I'm doing, and I don't believe I'm helping children. And I didn't see any improvement in children through the years. Sometimes we measure kids on how well they speak the jargon or how they use the language. But, whether or not they're really learning something, internalizing it, and getting something out of it, that's another story. And, it just became very, very difficult. And I did speak out about it. I did speak out because I saw it was negatively impacting on the children. All the things that we were doing that was supposed to be so wonderful, it was having a negative impact. I'll give you an example. When we started to put the LGBTQ posters up all over the elementary school, because that was mandatory, I had to do that. It was a compliance issue. It's an interesting word we use in education, compliance. You have to be compliant, which is kind of eerie. So I would put these posters up, and no sooner I started putting these posters up, it created problems. Kids were calling each other gay. They didn't understand what it meant. Most of them were really disinterested. But what I started to see shortly after putting the posters up were that many of my fourth grade girls, a disproportionate number, were coming out and saying, things like, well, I'm gay. They were coming out. And many of them came from backgrounds where that was unacceptable, and it put them at odds with their families. So they were feeling quite guilty.
Wait, I just want to stop you you're saying fourth grade. That's like 9 years old or 10 years old, 9 and 10-year-old girls. That's incredible.
Who never showed any signs of it at all. Do you know what I'm saying? Usually,
Right.
Sometimes you might see a sign. Children truly sometimes have gender dysphoria. It's a real thing. But it was happening now suddenly, to this particular age group, like a contagion. Okay. And because of the guilt that they were some of the young ladies were feeling, they were self-harming. They were cutting themselves. And then they would say,
now let me ask, so you didn't see these kind of problems among the girls before you started going around putting the posters up? Like self-harm, I mean, that kind of.
Did not come, no, kids did not come. Before that, honestly, I don't ever remember a child coming up to me and saying in fourth grade, I'm gay, or in any grade in elementary school, to be honest with you. But, they were feeling guilty. They were, felt like they were hiding something from their parents. But when I would ask them, well, what does gay mean to you? It means I like girls better than boys. They were confused. They were totally confused. And then I would have to say as a counselor, well, don't worry. I'm not allowed to tell your parents. It's okay. And it felt so uncomfortable for me. Okay. It felt like, I felt it didn't feel right. I felt like a groomer myself, like, why am I hiding things from parents? And not to say that I never hid things from parents. I had to report parents for child abuse. I had to, and I did when it was necessary. It was always drummed into us, be on the side of caution, err on the side of the kids, and which I always did. And sometimes I was wrong, but nevertheless, you had to be cautious. This was children. You're better off being wrong than, not reporting something.
Right.
But, the other thing that occurred to me is, with everything going on with the literature, with the inappropriate literature and all of these things, and keeping secrets from parents. And now keep in mind, these were parents that I had relationships with. When you're in a building for 20 years, you are now counseling the children of the children you counsel. And they trusted me. My community trusted me. They knew, they respected the fact that if they had done something wrong to the kids, I would make a report as necessary. But to hold things from the way I felt as a parent, well, gee, I wouldn't want that held from me. And the kids were obviously confused. And, there were more and more instances where I had an African-American student who didn't want to come to school. And, upon speaking with her, I found out that all of the talk, about race and everything else was making her majorly uncomfortable. She said, I just want to come to school and I want to be a kid. I don't want everybody to look at me like I'm different. And I totally could relate even as an adult, because with all of, 2 years ago, what was going on in the news and everything, for the first time in my life, I'm like, oh my God, you feel self-conscious of your color. And they were increasingly making us as adults, asking us to read books like this particular book, which they talk about offensive books. I was totally offended by it, but I didn't ask to ban it or anything. I just put it down and stopped reading it. But I'm an adult. So, children don't have choice. They see a book, they're going to pick it up. They don't know any better. I just felt like, well, who are we really helping? I saw through the years, my caseload went up and up and up. I saw children afraid to use the word Black, to use the word white, like as if they were offending. So they would apologize if they said the color. So it was just a lot of confusion. And I did speak out about it, and it wasn't well received. Let's put it that way. I was spoken to sort of about my own bias, what's going on inside of me. Me, who had gotten guidance counselor awards and things like that, suddenly I was doing everything wrong. I said, okay, if I'm doing everything wrong, then you're not selling me on that. I worked with kids for a long time. I have a child. I am not going to do this because you're not going to convince me of this lie. It is not.
No, that takes a lot of confidence and internal strength, which people don't have. I want to bring up a couple things. One, just what you said about the tests and not holding children to a standard, because all of us know, I mean, this is Socrates' idea, education to draw out of, right? That you're pulling a thread of something innate that people have. I strongly believe that people are fundamentally good, and that we have an innate knowledge of whether something is good or bad. That you innately know that it is bad to do harm to another person. There are many inhibitions against doing that. That's why they have to make violent video games, to get you over your inhibition of doing harm to another person. So, when you've done something that's not good. That's one of the great values of learning how to play an instrument, because if you're working on it and it sounds then you would be unhappy if your teacher said, that's really good, that's so beautiful. You'd say, well, it doesn't sound beautiful to me. Why don't you help me figure out how to do this? So right away, you're destroying the morale, because you're treating a child like they're, as you said, that you believe they're incapable of doing any better. So therefore, you think they're an inferior being, that they're never going to be able to learn this. and you're just trying to make them feel good. And a child will see through that in an instant. And I can imagine that that would have a devastating effect on their confidence and on their ability to interact with other children. If you don't know how to read and you're in a supermarket and you're trying to find something with the right ingredients, you're going to feel pretty uncomfortable and you're going to feel embarrassed if you have to ask somebody to help you. So that's the first thing I'm thinking. The other, which I really appreciated, as long as we're showing books, and I think you told me about this author, Dr. Miriam Grossman, and her book, Lost in Transnation, a child psychiatrist guide out of the madness. And the whole first section of the book, what she's doing, it's really dedicated to the parents, because she said, you're going to be bombarded by these people with PhDs and multiple degrees who are supposedly the experts, and they're going to tell you, we know what is best for your child, and you have to go along. And she said, you know your child. You might say, well, I'm just a truck driver. What do I know about early childhood psychology and education? And so she dedicates the beginning of the book to trying to get the people who really love the children to have confidence in their gut feeling about what is in the best interest of the child, which it seems that they're trying to drum out of them. But anyway, these are some things that come to mind right away. So please go ahead, continue.
Well, I feel we do elevate ourselves. We did above the parents, but you know what? Yes, there are parents that are not the best parents. Okay, but you can't treat every parent like that. And you can't blame the lack of success, the lack of achievement always on the parents or on the kids for that matter. I used to think to myself, because, when you speak one-on-one or in a small group with a child, I knew some of those kids were very, very, very bright, but they just couldn't make it in the classroom. And I would say to myself, what is going on? I know this kid has a great mind and there's a great thought process going on here. Gee, maybe it's time for us to take a look at what we're doing wrong. And, it's a funny thing, but once I got out of the system and I spent the last 2 years, it was in June, doing a lot of research and a lot of reading, I'm like, wow, a lot of my suspicions, now it's making sense. And, one of the things was the movement away from phonics. I mean, if you trace it back, our kids basically became illiterate, because when we have only 1/3 of the kids reading on grade level in this country, it's really pretty illiterate if you think about it. And just as you said, like when I think of my own parents who only made it, I think, to the 10th grade, and yet my mother could look at my college level writing and say to me, that's redundant, or that's incorrect grammar. It was glaring to me. I paid attention to these things. And then when I got into the system, because I was already an adult, I was in my 30s when I started. I was like, wow. I didn't, it was almost unrecognizable to me.
When did they get rid of phonics? Because I do remember that, even 30 years ago, that was happening. When was there a specific time when that occurred?
I think it was more than 30 years ago. I read another very interesting book, this one, Crimes of the Educators. This gives you really an understanding of what happened in education as far as literacy. It's a fascinating book. Forgive me for not remembering the exact year. But, the book talks about it was deliberate, that it was deliberately done.
Do they say a motivation? Why would anyone want to make children illiterate?
They're easy to control. They're easier to revolutionize. I mean, why would we teach children how to be activists? Why would they give me comic books about activism to give to children? And I'm sorry, I would have had that to show today, but I put it out at one of my Moms for Liberty tables, and it walked away, and I only had one copy. But why would we do that? Like, You know, we want
think about the green movement, right? They're making children terrified that we're destroying the planet. So now every time you have a thunderstorm, I imagine the children are saying, oh, my mommy is driving too much. If she would stop using a car, then the weather wouldn't change and the planet's going to be destroyed. I mean, they're using hysteria and terror to catapult these children into something, again, that they don't understand. I
Diane
mean,
are so spot on right about that, because think about it, children today. First of all, we traumatized kids with COVID. I had kids who didn't want to come to school because they were afraid to kill their grandparents. Remember now, talking about children. Children's minds are different than adult minds. They think very differently. And 23 years of sitting and really listening and loving my kids and adoring them and listening to them from the minute I walked in the door to the minute I left. I recognized how kids think. It's not the same way we think. And for kids, literally, why don't you want to come to school when you could connect with them, as a counselor to hear, well, I'm afraid I'm going to kill my grandparents or my mother or my baby or they fear for themselves because they're very, self-centered. That's very normal for kids.
right.
And they have very little to be happy about. If you're a child today, you go to school, okay, you're taught that America's not a great country. We're racist. You're a victim or you're an oppressor. The world is coming to an end. Police are bad. Kids loved police officers. Kids loved all this. They just, held them to the highest. So it's like you're teaching children everything about their lives are bad, and now you're teaching them they're born in the wrong body, possibly. That all their problems stem from the fact that they're born. What do they have to be happy about? And you wonder why the depression rates are
Right.
so.
And the suicides are tripling.
Mhm.
Now, I would like to just shift for a minute to talk a little bit about the specific fight in Wayne County. And I do have a slide, but maybe you could say what's happening in Wayne County, New York, a little bit, and we can show the picture of one of the publications that was on the library shelves there. And I guess, unfortunately, there was a setback for the schools, what Jennifer told me today. But could you say something about what's happening there?
Jennifer explained to me that a parent was successful about getting pornographical material out of the school libraries. Now, this is middle school, high school library we're talking about, grades 6 to 12. The parent is now being sued for getting that. The parent and the school, I believe, I didn't read it that carefully. I thought Jennifer would be on to explain, but they're being sued for daring to get that pornographical material out of the school. So that's
now, if you think we're exaggerating about pornographic, and I don't want to read this, I'm going to ask Dave to please put the text on the screen. You can see that all boys aren't blue. And then he's going to zoom in to part of the text, and you'll just have to read it. I find it just too disgusting. But as you can see, this is the text that's sitting there on a library shelf, accessible in a school, not just a public library for everyone that has children's sections and sections on pornography that adults may know that they are there, but a school where any child could have access. And my understanding from Jennifer is that this now got reversed, or the board, after pressure from the union, voted that they're going to now put these things back on the shelves. They've gotten them removed, and they're saying they're going to have some kind of process for limiting who has access, or who knows. We'll see what happens. But why is this there? And how is anyone going to benefit? If you go back to what we were talking about earlier, what is our nation going to be doing? What are we trying to prepare these young people to do? You would think the school is dedicated to preparing young people to become future leaders of society, participants in a productive society, empathetic with their fellow human beings, happy, um, and what is the purpose of this?
I believe it's serving the adults, and industry, because this is my feeling, if you put all this garbage in the schools, there, first of all, there's no literary genius. Okay, I don't think we'll be reading this stuff 100 years from now. I don't think we'll hopefully not remember it. Kids don't want to hear or see this stuff. Kids know what they're ready to hear or see. Okay, kids, when a kid would come across something, say, for example, that another child brought that was inappropriate to school, the first thing they would do, Miss Chen, so and so brought this. Look. They knew better themselves that they would be embarrassed. They didn't want to see it. They knew. It is an industry. So my feeling is you're giving kids all the language of sex. It's in the books. What happens when kids have computers in their hands? Okay, you're giving them all the language of sex. Okay, and then when they search anything up, who's waiting out there for them? Bad people are waiting out there for them. Things are going to pop up. They're going to see all sorts of things. And, people are not talking about sex addiction in this country, or the fact that we are one of the number one consumers of child pornography in this country. So people are making a lot of money on this stuff. And now you're putting it in the schools and creating lifelong customers for it.
Right.
You can't see it ranking.
No, so this is hideous. So you have the sexual predators looking for children, looking this stuff up online. You have the human trafficking, which now is increasing greatly with the migrant situation. And you have this whole question of the gender dysphoria and children really being pushed into surgery and hormone therapy at a very early age. And you were commenting on the amount of money. I guess there's a lot of clinics and places popping up that are making a huge amount of money off of this. I think it's also, as I said, I haven't gotten that far in Dr. Grossman's book about how damaging it is to the children who go through it. But they're putting themselves through a great deal of pain and suffering and agony. And then what you were saying at the beginning. So your child doesn't know how to read. They believe that if they're exhaling, they're destroying the planet, that they either are a racist or they are a victim of racism, and that the world is likely going to end anytime soon. And then you say, look, if you just change, probably the reason you're really unhappy is that you were meant to be a boy. And if you just get this surgery and cut off certain parts of your anatomy and stitch on other parts of your anatomy and take a bunch of hormones that are going to give you headaches and make you feel horrible, everything's going to be better because you will finally be at home in the body that you were intended to have. I mean, is that it?
Yes, that's it. And the surgery is making a lot of money, absolutely. Got on so many levels: plastic surgery, speech pathology, the amount, what you put a child through to have this surgery, they will never be normal functioning adults. And I wrote an article about it, and I compared it to years ago when we did frontal lobotomies, and what an outrage that became. We made movies about it, and who gets to determine whose brain to hack up? Okay, here you took an organ that was functioning, and you treated a mental health problem with a surgical solution, and it was horrible. But as horrible as it was, Diane, it lasted for 30 years. And my question here is, are we going to destroy kids' bodies for 30 years? Are we going to continue to castrate them? Because that's essentially what you're doing. Do amputations on them. I mean, some of the surgery, when you change a boy into a girl, you now cut the urethra, which makes them prone to all sorts of infections and things like that, which makes them have to have antibiotics, which we know what that's going to do eventually, because it's going to be constant. And the same thing for girls. For girls, it's the opposite. They have to stretch it. So you're really, really damaging the body. And it's painful. Some of these surgeries are painful. And it's plastic surgery, it's hormone therapy, and you may go through all of that and never achieve the body that you want or find the happiness that you want. Just like the anorexic. Oh, when I reach that magical weight, I can relate to this. All life is going to be wonderful. Life is going to be happy. And you realize, well, gee, it wasn't the weight at all. You're not treating the underlying problem. And, depending on who's approving the surgery, I don't know that these kids are going through a heck of a lot of screening before we're putting them under the knife or allowing them to go under the knife. Because even, I always found this strange, like the screening for ADHD, it's really not very I don't know. I never saw it as very scientific. Maybe I'm wrong, but it was questionnaires. It was a questionnaire you gave the doctor, the school, and the parent. And then you took the 3 questionnaires, and if they correlated on X amount of things, boom, kid is on Adderall. So, increasing numbers of kids were getting medicated. And I didn't see it as very scientific. And again, here we are, like we're putting kids under the knife and doing these intrusive, horrible surgeries. It's amputation. Any amputation has really serious dangers, psychologically and physically. Unnecessarily. Very unnecessarily.
No, I was reading, Dr. Grossman said, yes, of course, as you just said, there are people, a tiny percentage, who have gender dysphoria, or people who actually are born with a confusion in their chromosomes. I think she says that's like 0.02%, right? It's a very tiny number where it's legitimate. But she has a case study in here, which I probably can't find again right at my fingertips, but of a woman who herself was a transgender advocate, now married to a trans man, I think, who got a job working at one of these clinics and became so horrible. She said, when I first started there, we had maybe 10 cases a month. Now we have 90 cases a month. And she said, I thought that the work that they were doing would be backed up by mountains of research. It turned out it wasn't. And she said, now what I'm seeing are a dozen girls coming in from the same middle school, right? So it's like a clique that this is now the popular thing to do, is go in and have your breasts chopped off before they develop and start the hormone therapy. And she said that this is not some little case of someone really in need. This is something being organized with no scientific criteria to back it up. And you have people in the industry clearly making a huge amount of money off of it. And again, I say, but what is the mission of people? What is your life? I mean, if you think about Socrates, when he was ordered to drink hemlock for quote unquote corrupting the youth, because he was engaging in dialogue with young people that the ruling class felt undermined their authority, because he was showing people that they could make discoveries and understand truth for themselves. And then when Socrates was going to die from drinking the poison, which took a certain amount of hours to take effect, his friends were all coming to visit him, and they were saying, this is so terrible. And first they tried to not have him drink the hemlock. They said, can't you just escape? And he said, no, someone has to stand for justice. I'm going to abide by the law. I'm hoping that we can change our state so he wouldn't flee. And then he took the hemlock, and they were all crying and sobbing, and his wife was devastated. And they said, well, why aren't you unhappy? And he said, well, because I feel like the identity of a philosopher, if you're really trying to know the truth, all of these things in the physical world that you consider so important that I'm going to leave are really distractions. My clothing, my food, all these physical things, they're not coming with me when I die. What's really important in my life is a quality of immortality. And I have to imagine, how does Moses look at my life? And he names a bunch of people who died before him. What is my life in their eyes? And all of these ephemeral things of the flesh are merely a distraction from our own spiritual and intellectual development. And I can't help but thinking how totally destructive this is when you have these minds which are so capable of making discoveries, of discovering things about themselves which are truly profound. And instead, you're going to get them addicted to drugs, whether they're prescribed drugs or illegal drugs, get them addicted to pornography, get them addicted to their cell phone, right? This is a whole other topic which we have to find people who can speak out about. I mean, we know they tell you if you get a like on Facebook that you actually get a chemical reaction. So you have, our phones are creating physical chemical addictions by behavior modification. So our children are getting bombarded by all of this sensory input, which is preventing us from developing the most important part of us, which is the part that is immortal and not in the flesh. But what do you think about that?
No, I have to agree. There's no meaning. There's nothing lasting. I think of everything that kids have today and how it's going to have no meaning later on. Like the music. I often think, like, I listen to even what my daughter listens to sometimes, and I say, are you going to remember that song 30 years from now? Because she's always marvels at the fact that I can remember words to songs from when I was a kid. Not that all the music was perfect, but there was a lot of music that they don't go away, or stories or quotes. Everything is fleeting, it's passing, it's on the screen. I hold on to my books at this point like they're gold, because I feel like, they could erase everything at the click of a button. What are we going to have left in the future really about the truth? Like everything's digital now. It's subjective based on whoever's in control of it. And there's going to be nothing permanent, and there's nothing classic, and there's nothing, I don't know. It's just, everything's make-believe. It is a make-believe world. It's those make-believe lives. I used to have to tell kids all the time, honey, everything you see on the internet it's because it's there doesn't mean it's real. Having somebody click a button and say, I like you, that's not a friendship. And then we'd have to really sit there and talk about what is a friendship. Let's talk about what friendship really is. That means nothing. Anybody could click a button, but to be a friend, that takes a little bit more. Like, it's just such a fake world. My daughter, with the pictures, with the photos, I'm referring to her, she's a 20-year-old. You can't just snap a candid picture of her. It's like, oh no, that's terrible. I'm like, but these are the pictures you look at 20 years from now and you remember the moment and you laugh because somebody caught you off guard. It's fun, it's meaningful. There's none of that. There's nothing anymore. I wouldn't trade places with these children. And you know what? All they want is to be kids. I would look at the children every day, and they were their happiest selves for that 20 minutes of recess after they ate lunch. And I would love to be out there with them and see them running around and just being goofy kids and giggling, and if you gave them an option, they would probably run around that schoolyard all day, most of them. A few kids in the corner reading a book, a few would want to be on
Right.
the phone or whatever. But most of the kids are just running around, laughing and being kids. We don't let them be kids anymore. We schedule every single part of their day. And,
Mhm.
I don't know whether it started with Dr. Spock or what, you know, parents always feeling, not to find it from within what's right for their children, but to look outside to somebody else, what's right for my child. And I would tell parents all the time when they came in my office, this is your child. You know your child better than anyone. You have to be sure and be firm, because if you're wishy-washy about things, then your child is going to feel that same, they're not going to feel confident either. You have to feel, confidence. And we try to intimidate parents. We tell parents, if you don't do XYZ, your kids are going to kill themselves. So look at what's going on in California. Now, if you don't accept your child's gender identity, you're in threat of getting your child taken from you. I mean, you know, again, not all parents are perfect. I've learned that through the years, but most parents are doing the best they can. And if you let them do it, they probably do a pretty good job. But it's like what we've done to police officers. They can't do their jobs. Well, guess what? Parents can't do their jobs anymore either.
Right. Well, also, I think that has to do a lot with what happened with mental health. We literally shut down over 90% of the psychiatric beds in the nation. So there's no place for people to get care. There's no idea that this is an illness and that you can do better or you can be rehabilitated. And these people are just out on the streets with no assistance, or they're in the prisons, and it creates an impossible situation. The economy collapsing is another impossible situation. In 2018, the New York City public schools had 100,000 children who were homeless. That didn't mean in a shelter necessarily. Maybe there were 5 of them sleeping in their aunt's living room, but it's still not a stable situation. And some schools had 40 or 50% of their classes homeless children. How can you teach? How can they learn? How can anyone learn in that situation? Now, there's a question that came in, if you want to take it, and we need to wrap up pretty soon. But someone's asking on these surgeries, these transgender surgeries, are they covered by the parents' insurance? Does someone, even if the parents are opposed to it, who pays for this? Where they get the money to pay for all this surgery?
Information on that is there's not. I haven't found. I did read something that said yes, the parent, but then again, I forget which states. Different states have different laws, but I do believe the parents. It go it. I don't want to speak to that because I'm not 100% sure, but it's a good question of something I really need to research. But I think I've read that parents become responsible. I've also been reading a lot about clinics being put right into the schools. The number of clinics, yes, in the school buildings themselves has grown exponentially. Okay, there used to be just a small few in the most impoverished areas, but this industry is now growing as well.
Well,
So I noticed through the years more and more things were done at the school level. The dentist came to the school. The doctor started to come to the school. Keep in mind, minor age children can get birth control without parental consent. I believe they can get the morning after pill. And I think they can get abortions. There's a lot of things. There is actually a website that I found that kids can go to. People aren't aware. So when you go to the pediatrician and they say, could you wait outside, mom? They talk privately now to your kid. And this even happened to me since my daughter was about 13. This is not new. A lot of this stuff was brewing at least a decade ago
hmm,
with pronouns and everything else. I just, you don't believe it's going to stay. You think it's going to go. But I started going to meetings and equity trainings probably close to 10 years ago. And I remember the first one I went to how they were saying we have to abolish the system, we have to revolutionize, and some of the language they started to use, very revolutionary. Reimagine. These are some of the words.
Right.
Compliance issue. I'm like, compliance, where are we?
Right.
Even the words are creepy. And I was so offended by some of the stuff I heard that I actually spoke to my principal, who told me, who really wasn't all in this stuff at the point that the points like now, like she is now. And she said, go home, say you don't feel good and go home, because that's how offensive I found it. But sometimes people are just not ready to hear things. They'd rather believe a credible lie than an incredible truth. And when I would talk about this stuff, people just looked at me like, like, what are you talking about?
Right.
And it's come to fruition. It's all come to fruition, because now it's out there. I mean, there are forms the schools even give out if you want to change your child's gender or name, what they want to be called. Yes, Board of Ed, with the Board of Ed letterhead. So the school system is all in this stuff.
Well, we have quite a fight. We have to wrap up. I just want to say a couple things. One, that people should know, in North Carolina, the legislature was able to reverse a bunch of this with a large enough majority that they overrode the governor's policy. So in North Carolina, doctors cannot perform transgender surgery on minors. They cannot teach sex ed from kindergarten through 4th grade. Some of this, I feel like saying, why do you need a law to know that? But at any rate, your kindergartner does not get sex ed in North Carolina. The question of parental consent, that the parents have to be consulted if the child is a minor. And I want to just be very clear. Obviously, there are cases where there are reasons why you need to speak with the child and keep things from the parent, as you said. There are cases where parents are abusive. I imagine there are cases of incest. There are reasons why, in some cases, you can't talk to the parents. But that is not the majority of the cases, and it can't be the practice. And the whole reason why you're not allowed to vote until you're 18, and I know a lot of people who think it should be a bit older right now at this point, why you're not supposed to get married when you're 14 years old or 12 years old. There are certain, we all know, as you said, we can reflect on when we were 10, 11, 12 years old, and we weren't thinking straight. And that's because we were children. And that's why you need people with more experience and hopefully more wisdom, who have your interest at heart, who will look out for you. And I think that's one of the ways they really take advantage, is they say, if you don't allow your child to do this very destructive thing, that you will hurt your child. And so people who want to be kind, want to do what's best, get hoodwinked into actually doing something that's very destructive.
That's true.
So I really want to thank you very much for joining me. People who want more information, I presume, can go to Moms for Liberty. Is that the name of the website?
Moms for Liberty, Queens, New York @gmail.com, or momsforliberty.org/chapters/Queens-County-NY. If you go to the momsforliberty.org and put the county and put Queens County, it will come up that way also.
Great. But momsforliberty.org is the website, and people can look and see if there's a chapter near you. I would like to thank people for joining. I will say that on this coming Thursday, there's going to be another Humanity for Peace rally at the United Nations from 1 until 3. Dag Hammarskjöld. September 21st is International Peace Day. One thing that might make a lot of us feel much better and less anxiety ridden would be if we were not on the brink of a major war between the United States and Russia, or the United States and China, and that mankind as a whole needs to grow up and find a better way to resolve conflicts than inflicting harm on one another. I also would just like to say, I think the Indian space program, the Chinese space program, are very inspiring because they have the astronauts talking to the entire population at once, millions of children. And I know there are few schools across the United States when we have someone from the International Space Station speaking to the schools, but why not engage our children in things that are really exciting and really interesting, where they can feel happy about the potential for the human race, as opposed to worrying that we're all going to bring our doom down around our shoulders. So those are my final thoughts. Thank you, Elena, so much. Please, if you want to volunteer for my campaign or donate, the campaign needs funds, SARE4Senate.com. You can donate on the website. You can sign up on the website. And with any luck, we will see each other here again next week. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.